Welcome back to part 2 of this analysis. It is advised you watch part 1 before watching this video. Now, we shall continue. More troubling for McClellan was a new and rather sudden threat that came up on the same day, March 8, 1862, one that kings and generals forgot to address in this video, the Battle of Hampton Roads. Some may be asking, why must we discuss the Battle of Hampton Roads when we're discussing the Peninsula Campaign? To answer this, if we are to understand why McClellan had to pivot from landing at Urbana to utilizing Fort Monroe as the base of operations, we must first understand this naval battle and its consequences. How the ironclad CSS Virginia forced McClellan to change his plans and reorient his efforts further to the south. This leads us into the second video we will be discussing, though not in its entirety. All that is relevant to us will be their section concerning the creation of the CSS Virginia and the naval battle in question. For this, we will first address a number of false claims made by kings and generals regarding this matter. These are: first, the notion that Secretary of the Navy, Stephen R. Mallory, was undermined by Jefferson Davis by the reallocation of resources and usage of privateers. Second, the CSS Virginia was not completed to the specifications attested to by the designs in question. This includes lacking the 4 inches of armor she was designed for, nor having the gunport shutters she was designed to use. Third, the CSS Virginia had suffered damage that had dramatically affected her performance. Fourth, the USS Monitor's 11th-inch Dahlgren guns were the largest guns that could be found on short notice. Fifth, that the USS Monitor rotated the turret to only present the armor, and that she was bashing gaps into the CSS Virginia's armor. Sixth, that the CSS Virginia was badly damaged after its engagement with USS Monitor. All of these claims necessarily require a proper breakdown of the events that led to the naval battle, the ships in question, and the actions on March 8th and 9th. First, let us discuss the situation faced by Mallory upon taking up the position of Secretary of the Navy. As stated previously, the Confederacy was faced with considerable issues with resource shortages across the board, though not due to a lack of effort. However, one event was a significant boon for the Confederacy on the whole: the capture of Gosport Naval Yard. The capture of Gosport Naval Yard itself is a testament to the ingenuity of the men of the South, which we will touch upon briefly. On April 17, 1861, Virginia Governor John Lecter presented orders to William Booth Tulliver, Major General of the Virginia Militia, to assume command of the militia units assembling within Norfolk in the effort to capture the naval yard. Some of the locals had attempted to pressure the garrison, led by Commodore McCauley, to surrender the port. However, they had remained in place. Tulliver was able to muster 8 cannons and about 850 men, which, by itself, would not secure the town. However, William Mahone, president of the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad at the time, had concocted a brilliant plan to force the Federals from the naval yard. He began to run a train up and down the railroad line while civilians would arrive and shout, creating the deception of the arrival of a large military force. This, along with the growing hostility of the civilian population and lack of word on reinforcements, prompted Commodore McCauley to abandon Gosport Naval Yard on the evening of April 20th, 1861, scuttling a large number of ships in the process. As stated previously in this analysis, the capture of the naval yard yielded the capture of over 500 artillery pieces, mainly naval-grade weaponry. With the capture of the naval yard, Stephen Mallory would address Jefferson Davis on an outline of his plan for the Navy in a report issued on April 26, 1861. This report outlines the necessity of purchasing civilian craft for the time being to suit the Navy's needs, but also outlines greater ambitions for the Confederate Navy. I propose to adopt a class of vessels hitherto unknown to naval services. The perfection of a warship would doubtless be a combination of the greatest known ocean speed with the greatest known floating battery and power of resistance, and such a combination has been diligently but vainly sought, with but little regard to cost, by Great Britain and France. Vessels built exclusively for ocean speed at a low cost, with a battery of 1 or 2 accurate guns of long range, with an ability to keep the sea upon a long cruise and to engage or to avoid an enemy at will, are not found in their navies, and only to a very limited extent in that of the United States, the speed and power of whose ships are definitely known. One of the measures that would attempt to get the fledgling Navy off the ground was the sanctioning of privateering. On May 14, 1861, the Confederate Congress would pass a lengthy resolution, 5 sections in total, sanctioning how prizes seized by privateers would be handled, their entitlement, and so on. Contrary to Kingston General's statement, Stephen Mallory was not opposed to this. According to John V. Quarstein, this was a part of the 2-part plan of countering the Union's naval superiority. The merchant raiders would focus their efforts on attacking Union naval vessels, thus disrupting their economy, while the southern harbors would be defended by the Confederate naval vessels such as those proposed in his April 26th letter. With this plan outlined, Mallory would set about the business of implementing this strategy. His first goal was to attempt to procure vessels from overseas. The Confederate Congress had allocated $2 million specifically for the purchase of an ironclad frigate from either France or England. However, these efforts, led by Lieutenant James M. North, were in vain. While this endeavor was attempted, Mallory began to determine what resources could be made available for the construction of ironclads. On May 14, 1861, he instructed Captain Lawrence Rousseau to identify any manufacturer capable of producing iron plating between 2.5 to 5 inches thick. Meanwhile, Captain Duncan Nathaniel Ingram was sent to various foundries in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia to see if iron plating could be acquired from them. However, due to the ongoing war, they were unable to furnish the resources necessary for the production of ironclads. In spite of these setbacks, he was able to find an ironworks that was capable of producing 1 to 2 inch thick iron plates and was willing to furnish them for the Navy, an ironworks that we've addressed previously in this analysis, Tredegar Ironworks in Richmond, Virginia. With the source of iron plating found, Mallory sought designs for these new warships. He contacted Lieutenant John Mercer Brooke to design these floating batteries. Prior to the war, John Mercer Brooke was a well-respected inventor, developing a fathommeter for topographic mapping, which proved useful when he worked with Matthew Fontaine Maury on mapping the ocean floor, and he engaged in mapping new shipping routes to the Orient. However, with the secession of Florida, his home state, he offered his resignation and sided with the Confederacy. Now tasked with designing a new battery ironclad, Brooke would eventually come up with a floating battery concept. In a conference on June 23, 1861, naval constructor John Luke Porter and chief engineer William Price Williamson met with Mallory to discuss ideas for the new vessel. On February 26, 1863, Brooke testified before a joint House investigation committee on the affairs of the Naval Department, in which he described the conceptualization of the vessel that would become CSS Virginia. They came up, and this constructor brought with him a model. I should have said that the name of the constructor was J.L. Porter. This model is now one of the models in the Secretary's room. It consisted of a shield and hull, the extremities of the hull terminating with a shield, forming a sort of box or scow, upon which the shield was supported. The Secretary directed the constructor, Chief Engineer Williamson, and myself to meet him at my office here. We met there, and this model was examined by us all, and the form of the shield was approved. It was considered a good shield, and for ordinary purposes, a good boat for harbor defense. The Secretary then called the attention of Mr. Porter and Mr. Williamson to the drawing, giving a general idea of the vessel I proposed. The difference between the model and my drawing consisted in the one I proposed having the ends prolonged and shaped like those of any fast vessel, and in order to protect them from the enemy, they were to be submerged 2 feet under water, so that nothing was to be seen afloat but the shield itself. The object of having these parts of the vessel submerged was to gain speed and to have buoyancy without exposing the hull, and to avoid increasing the draft of the water. Mr. Porter and Mr. Williamson, after looking at the drawing, approved of it, and the Secretary directed us to get up a vessel on that plan. Mr. Porter's shield and the one I proposed were almost identical. With the conceptual design agreed upon, Porter set about designing a vessel of this make, while Williamson and Brooke set off to Tredegar to procure an engine. However, the latter was not forthcoming, requiring 12 months of work before such an engine could be made. However, there was a solution to the lack of an engine at the time. During the scuttling of the ships berthed at Gosport Naval Yard, one screw frigate, the USS Merrimac, had been burned down to the waterline. Her machinery, though waterlogged, was still intact. Brooke further elaborated. Mr. Williamson subsequently stated that the engines of the Merrimac could be repaired and made available, but that they could not be used well in any other vessel unless she had equal draft of water, or nearly equal. Mr. Williamson proposed to put the shield on the Merrimac. Porter, Williamson, and Brooke agreed upon this course of action. Shortly after their conference on June 23rd, they met with Mallory to discuss their proposal. Sir, in obedience to your order, we have carefully examined and considered the various plans and propositions for constructing a shot-proof steam battery, and respectfully report that, in our opinion, the steam frigate Merrimac, which is in such condition from the effects of fire as to be useless for any other purpose without incurring a very heavy expense in her rebuilding, etc., can be made an efficient vessel of that character mounting heavy guns, and from the further consideration that we cannot procure a suitable engine and boilers from any other vessel without building them, which would occupy too much time. It would appear that this is our only chance to get a suitable vessel in a short time. The bottom of the hull, boilers, and heavy and costly parts of the engine being but little injured reduces the cost of construction to about 1/3 of the amount which would be required to construct such a vessel anew. We cannot, without further examination, make an accurate estimate of the cost of the proposed work, but think it will be about the most of which will be for labor, the materials being nearly all in the Navy Yard, except the iron plating to cover the shield. The plan to be adopted in the arrangement of the shield for glancing shot, mounting guns, arranging the hull, etc., and plating will be in accordance with the plan submitted for approval of the department. According to Quarstein, the price, which had been left out of the letter above, was approximately $110,000, and the gun count would have been 10 guns, in accordance with the final plan for the vessel. This plan would be approved by Mallory and would be set upon by the three men. John Porter, the only naval constructor of the Confederacy at the time, was in charge of the refitting of the burned-out hulk of Merrimac into the ironclad she would become. By July 1861, the first process, cutting down the burned sections of the hull to the designated level, had begun. Porter would describe the process of trimming down the hull and some of the issues encountered. Having calculated the weight of the hull as I intended to fit her, with much care, and everything that was to go on her, as armor, guns, machinery, ammunition, stores, shot, coal and shells, etc., I found that I could cut her hull down to 19 feet fore and aft, and then have a surplus of 50 tons displacement. But when I drew my line, I found I would cut 1 foot into the propeller. This I did not wish to do for several reasons. First, it would make more work and consume time. Second, it would reduce her speed, which I did not wish to do. Consequently, I raised the line to 20 feet aft, holding the 19 feet forward. By August, the process of building the iron casemate had already begun. This portion was built first with 14-inch thick yellow pine beams laid down at a 35-degree angle. Next, a 4-inch layer of pine planking was added horizontally, followed by a vertical layer of 4-inch oak plating. Then came the iron plating. One layer of 2-inch thick, 8-foot-long pieces of iron plating was placed horizontally, followed by the outermost layer of the same dimensions placed vertically. This was run through with long bolts, which were held by large nuts on the interior of the hull. The end result was a casemate that had a perpendicular thickness of 22 inches of wood and 4 inches of armor, but with its 35-degree inclination, totaled to over 4 feet of armored protection. Contrary to the claim of kings and generals, there is no evidence to indicate that she sailed out without being fully armored. The method in which the armor was fitted would render such a possibility absurd, as it would require adjusting the length of all of the bolts to account for the lack of said layering. We cannot be sure where he would have got this claim from, though, in my humble opinion, this was likely due to a misunderstanding upon the researcher's part, reading two 2-inch layers of iron plating and deducing it meant 1 layer. However, this is pure speculation, which I shall not entertain any further. What was a pressing matter, however, was the production of said rolled iron plates. Testing on Jamestown Island in October 1861 by John Brooke had shown the inadequacy of 3 layers of 1-inch iron plating, yet demonstrated that 2 inches of 2-inch iron plating was sufficient for protection. The issue, however, was that of Tredegar Ironworks. At the time, it was only capable of producing 1-inch rolled iron plates. Joseph Reed Anderson, president of Tredegar Ironworks, set to work making improvements to the iron rollers, which were rapidly converted and prepared. The second difficulty was punching the holes required for the bolts. A solution was found for this, though it required additional time and money for the production of the plates. Iron itself became an issue. Due to the wartime demands, the procurement of additional iron became difficult. However, they were able to obtain the vital resource by scrapping obsolete ordnance and from the remains of the burned-out sections of Gosport Naval Yard. The most pressing of these issues was, ultimately, the transportation of the iron to Norfolk. With the Southern railway system overburdened with shipments of men, material, and supplies for the armies, it placed considerable delays upon the construction of the CSS Virginia, slowing it to a crawl. The wooden sections of the casemate were ready by November, yet the last shipment of iron plating did not come in until February 12, 1862. In conjunction with the construction of CSS Virginia, John Brooke developed a unique rifled cannon, his namesake Brooke rifle. Brooke developed 2 variants of this rifled gun, the 7-inch and the 6.4-inch Brooke rifle, with the former being capable of throwing a 100-pound shell 4.5 miles with a 12-pound charge. Of these, 2 7-inch Brooke rifles would be installed in the fore and aft sections of the casemate, which, after some redesigning, enabled for the guns to be pivoted through 3 separate port holes. Brooke would develop for his rifled gun explosive shells and an elongated bolt for armored piercing. However, as it was surmised that the Virginia would be facing only wooden vessels, the latter armor-piercing rounds were delayed in their production. This act would have unintended consequences in the coming engagement. There were also other lingering issues with the ironclad. As the CSS Virginia was reusing the engine and equipment from the USS Merrimac, it brought with it all of the kinks of the predecessor. On April 5, 1862, Henry Ashton Ramsay, chief engineer of the CSS Virginia, wrote a report on this issue after her sea trials the day prior. Sir, from my past and present experience with the engines of this vessel, I am of the opinion that they cannot be relied upon. During a cruise of 2 years whilst I was attached to this ship in the United States service, they were continually breaking down, at times when least expected, and the ship had to be sailed under canvas during the greater part of the cruise. When she returned, the chief engineer reported that all experiments to improve their working and reliability had failed, and, as the defects were radical, embracing the entire engines, recommended that they should be removed from the vessel, and such was the intention of the U.S. government before she fell into our hands. The engines gave out yesterday, as I had occasion to report to you, after running only a few hours, and as I cannot ensure their working any length of time consecutively, I deem it my duty to make this report. This, of course, was less a failure on the part of the men working on her conversion, and more an issue of the inherent flaws with the engine. However, as time was short and the necessity to press her into service great, the engines would have to perform their job. The rush to complete the vessel would become an effort of the whole of the city of Norfolk. On January 11, 1862, the blacksmiths and finishers of Norfolk signed a public testament volunteering their efforts to complete the vessel, free of charge, and work as late as 8 o'clock in the evening to complete this vessel. These efforts proved fruitful as, on February 17, 1862, the CSS Virginia would be commissioned into the Confederate Navy. As the Virginia was being constructed, Lieutenant Catesby Ap Roger Jones would be appointed the executive officer of the new ironclad in November 1861. He would be presented with the task of finding men adequate enough to operate the new warship. Officers, as it turned out, were plentiful. Lieutenant John Taylor Wood was one such example. The grandson of Zachary Taylor, nephew-in-law of Jefferson Davis, and cousin to Brigadier General Richard Taylor, he had been an instructor at the Naval Academy before the war. In April 1861, he resigned his commission from the Navy and wished to remain neutral in the ongoing crisis. However, the hostility of the Lincoln administration prompted him to flee across the Potomac with his family. Lieutenant Charles Sims had already proved himself in the ongoing conflict. He had aided in the daring capture of the steamer St. Nicholas, later becoming her captain, the vessel renamed to CSS Richmond. Many of her junior officers, such as Henry Ashton Ramsey and Walter Raleigh Bott, had been arrested and detained by the federal government for their refusal to take an oath of allegiance to the Union during the eruption of hostilities. Now, after finding their way south, they would act as a part of the crew of the new ironclad. Securing men, however, proved a greater task. Naval recruiting stations were set up in Richmond and Norfolk, which proved to be useful in obtaining men for the CSS Virginia. However, this did not provide the quantity of men required to man her. Lieutenant Wood would travel to meet Major General John Bankhead Magruder, commanding the defenses on the peninsula along the Warwick River, and asked if men could be made available. He would relinquish a number of men for this endeavor, though many of the men were certainly not the best and brightest in the Army. Many of these men had already been court-martialed for various reasons, and often sentenced to 20 days or 30 days hard labor. Yet, Commanding Officer Jones was able to work with them. Captain Robert D. Minor would later write, "After great exertions, a crew was obtained, most of them being landsmen. Some of the so-called volunteers had bad characters from their commanding officers, who could not manage them, and were brought on board in double irons. Jones immediately had their irons struck off, and informed them that he would have no forced volunteers on board, and that if they wished to remain, they could do so and start fair with the other men, and make a character for themselves. This course proved eminently judicious, as some of them were the best men on board, and after serving complimented by Generals Lee and Magruder." Wood's efforts had proved to be fruitful. Commenting after the war, Wood described the matter thusly: "About 200 volunteered. Out of this number I selected 80 who had had some experience as seamen or gunners. Other commands at Richmond and Petersburg were visited, and so our crew of 300 was made up. They proved themselves to be as gallant and trusty a body of men as anyone would wish to command, not only in battle, but in reverse and retreat." The necessity of completing CSS Virginia became ever more paramount in the early months of 1862. Ambrose Burnside was conducting an offensive of the coastal regions of North Carolina. This campaign had been concocted by Burnside in October of 1861, proposed to McClellan and Stanton, and approved by the two. The plan would involve organizing a division of 12,000 to 15,000 men consisting of coastal traders, many of whom were to be inclined as mechanics. From there, a large number of transports would be gathered to support the division, with said division landing in strategic locations along the southern coast, penetrating into the interior and threatening the supply lines towards the Confederate forces amassing in Virginia. After some difficulty obtaining vessels with a shallow draft, Burnside was able to report on December 12th they had procured the necessary vessels, and by January 4th, 1862, they had begun the process of embarkation. By January 9th, after a snowstorm had blown through, and the 6th New Hampshire arrived on the evening of the 7th, the fleet embarked from Annapolis and began its journey to the Carolina coast. They stopped nearby Fortress Monroe on January 10th, where Flag Officer Lewis Malzerbs Goldsborough was waiting with the naval squadron under his command. On the night of the 11th, the whole force set off to sea, their destination being Hatteras Island on the outer banks of North Carolina. The fleet encountered rough weather as they went down the coast along the banks, which had led to the loss of 3 vessels: the Propeller, City of New York, the Pocahontas and her cargo of 100 horses, and the gunboat Zouave. Yet only 2 men were lost during the operation. By the 13th of January, the fleet had made it to Cape Hatteras. However, the channel that led into the sound side of the banks had a depth of only 6 feet, much shallower than the 8-foot draught of most of the supply vessels. After some cunning ingenuity, utilizing the strong current of the channel and the bottom of the boats to deepen the channel entrance, the fleet was able to cross Soundside by February 4th, 1862. By February 7th, the fleet arrived to their intended target, Roanoke Island. The island had been fortified by the Confederates with a 12-gun fortification, Fort Eugene, along with a small flotilla of Confederate gunboats. The Union gunboats engaged the Confederate gunboats in an intense duel, while Burnside's forces landed at Ashby's Harbor on the western portion of the island. By February 8th, the entire force of 15,000 men had landed on the island and advanced from Ashby's Harbor. In the center of the island, guarding a causeway built over marshy terrain, sat a Confederate battery of 3 guns along with a considerable force of Confederates. Burnside opted to assault the position with General Reno's brigade, taking up the left, General Foster's brigade taking up the center, and General Park's brigade taking up positions on the right flank. The 3 brigades assaulted the position simultaneously, breaking the Confederate defenders, forcing a retreat, and the subsequent surrender of the garrison, resulting in the capture of 2,500 men. The Battle of Roanoke Island was a major setback for the Confederates for a variety of reasons. The most pressing of these reasons was it endangered the supply chain for the city of Norfolk, Portsmouth, and the Hampton Roads area, as well as putting them in great danger of assault from the south. Brigadier General Henry A. Wise, former governor of Virginia, best summarized the predicament. That such is the importance and value, in a military point of view, of Roanoke Island, that it ought to have been defended by all the means in the power of the government. It was the key to all rear defenses of Norfolk. It unlocked 2 sounds, Albemarle and Currituck, 8 rivers, the North, West, Pasquotank, Perquimans, Little, Chowan, Roanoke, and Alligator, 4 canals, the Albemarle and Chesapeake, Dismal Swamp, Northwest, and Suffolk, and 2 railroads, the Petersburg and Norfolk, and the Seaboard and Roanoke. It guarded more than 4/5 of all Norfolk supplies of corn, pork, and forage, and it cut the command of General Eugene off from all its most efficient transportation. It endangers subsistence of his whole army, threatens the Naviotic Gosport, and to cut off Norfolk from Richmond, and both from railroad communication with the South. It lodges the enemy in a safe harbor from the storms of Hatteras, gives them a rendezvous, a large, rich range of supplies, and the command of the seaboard from Oregon Inlet to Cape Henry. It should have been defended at the expense of 20,000 men and of many millions of dollars. Faith had been lost in Major General Benjamin Huger's capabilities to defend Norfolk. In addition, it demonstrated a serious flaw in his command capabilities, a flaw that will become important later in this analysis. Thus, the importance of finishing CSS Virginia became an existential one for the citizens of the city. The outfitting process continued into the last weeks of February. 2 boats were mounted on the sides of the vessel, and, more importantly, shutters for the gun ports were manufactured. The first type that had been proposed to be used were compound shutters produced at Gosport, but these had been deemed unsatisfactory by John Brooke. Instead, a set of solid cast-iron shutters were produced at Tredegar Iron Works. However, these weren't completed until mid-February, resulting in only the bow and stern shutters covering the unused side gun ports arriving in time to be mounted. As a result, only these gun ports were covered by March 8th. However, it is worth noting that this was not due to an inability to furnish them, but due to a desire for higher quality that deprived the Virginia of these shutters. The last point of preparation was to find a captain suitable for this new vessel. This would come in the form of Franklin Buchanan. Technically, he was not the first in line to be captain. Based on seniority, 2 other men, French Forrest and Victor Randolph, were ahead of him for the position. However, Stephen Mallory wanted for Buchanan to be her captain, so to sidestep the issue, he appointed Franklin Buchanan as the commander of the James River defenses, thus enabling for Buchanan to make the Virginia his flagship. Franklin Buchanan was born on September 17, 1800 in Maryland and joined the Navy as a midshipman in January of 1815. He was the first superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, acted as the captain of the sloop of war Germantown during the Mexican-American War, commander of Commodore Matthew Perry's flagship USS Susquehanna during the Japanese expedition, and had been promoted to the rank of captain when the secession crisis began and the eruption of hostilities. During the Baltimore riots of April 19, 1861, Buchanan submitted his resignation on the presumption of Maryland secession. When this did not transpire, he asked to be reinstated, only to be rebuffed by Gideon Welles. Thus, he ended up in the Confederate Navy as a captain. Upon taking command of the Virginia, Stephen Mallory sent the following orders to Buchanan on February 24, 1862. Sir, you are hereby detached from the Office of Orders in Detail and will proceed to Norfolk and report to Flag Officer Forrest for the command of the Naval Defenses, James River. You will hoist your flag on the Virginia, or any other vessel of your squadron, which will, for the present, embrace the Virginia, Patrick Henry, Jamestown, Teaser, Raleigh, and Beaufort. The Virginia is a novelty in naval construction, is untried, and her powers unknown, and the department will not give specific orders as to her attack upon the enemy. Her powers as a ram are regarded as very formidable, and it is hoped that you may be able to test them. Like the bayonet charge of infantry, this mode of attack, while the most distinctive, will commend itself to you in the present scarcity of ammunition. It is one also that may be rendered destructive at night against the enemy at anchor. Even without guns, the ship would be formidable as a ram. Could you pass Old Point and make a dashing cruise on the Potomac as far as Washington, its effect upon the public mind would be important to the cause. The condition of our country and the painful reverses we have just suffered demand our utmost exertions, and convinced as I am that the opportunity and the means of striking a decided blow for our Navy are now for the first time presented, I congratulate you upon it, and know that your judgment and gallantry will meet all just expectations. Action, prompt and successful action, now would be of serious importance to our cause. And with my earnest wishes for your success, and for the happiness of yourself, officers, and crew. These were orders that Buchanan acted upon with haste. Though it would be unrealistic for him to sail north towards the Potomac, he sought to destroy the naval squadron stationed in Hampton Roads, which consisted of 5 capital ships of various size, and challenged the batteries nearby Newport News. For this plan to work, Franklin Buchanan sought the collaboration of Major General John B. Magruder. On March 2, 1862, he wrote a letter to Magruder detailing his course of action that upcoming Friday. His plan was for the CSS Virginia, along with Beaufort and Raleigh, to steam down the Elizabeth River, while Commander John Randolph Tucker's force, consisting of the Patrick Henry, Jamestown, and Teaser, would steam down the James. Both forces were to engage and destroy the frigates in Hampton Roads before turning the Virginia's guns on the batteries nearby Newport News. In this, he wished for Magruder to conduct an offensive in the endeavor to destroy as much of the Federal force as possible. However, Magruder was reluctant to aid in Buchanan's efforts. In a dispatch sent to the Inspector General on February 25th, he wrote the following. Sir, I have the honor to state that on the 21st, I received a dispatch from General Huger, stating 4 transports loaded with troops that had been sent to Newport News, and another dispatch from Captain Norris, my signal officer at Norfolk, that 3 regiments had been landed at Fort Monroe. I beg leave further to state I reported on the 20th instant that the roads here were in extremely bad order. They are so much worse that it is very doubtful if artillery can be carried down the country, and it will be positively necessary to diminish the usual amount of ammunition by 1/2 if carried. I am also satisfied that no one ship can produce such an impression upon the troops at Newport News as to cause them to evacuate the fort. The demoralization to our troops under similar circumstances has been produced by a concentration of fire from many ships at different points. No important advantages can be obtained by the Merrimac further than to demonstrate her power, which, as she is liable to be injured by a chance shot, at this critical time had better be reserved to defeat the enemy's serious efforts against Norfolk and James River. On March 3, 1862, Magruder would send a dispatch to Buchanan, stating, "Captain, it is too late to cooperate with my army in any manner below with the Merrimac, even if the roads will admit it, which they will not, for the enemy is very heavily reinforced both at Newport News and Fort Monroe, with infantry and 6 batteries of light artillery. It would have been glorious if you could have run into these as they were being landed from a Baltimore boat, a commercial transport. In addition to the above, I have been ordered to make such disposition of my troops as will enable me, in case necessity, to send reinforcements to Suffolk, obliging me to fall back to my second line, which I have done. Any dependence, therefore, upon me, so far as Newport News is concerned, is at an end." Buchanan would be on his own in the upcoming attack against the naval squadron, which may explain some of the events yet to come. In addition, the behavior exhibited by Magruder here will become relevant later in this analysis. However, Magruder's cold feet did not alter his plans by much. He was going for the naval squadron in Hampton Roads, and, unbeknownst to them, there was little they could do about it. The preparations were nearly complete. However, the weather took a turn on March 6th, imposing on Buchanan a 1-day delay, allowing for a final shipment of gunpowder to be loaded aboard. The Virginia would set sail that Saturday, March 8th, 1862. The morning of March 8th, 1862 was a pleasant, mild spring day. The gale had passed over, leaving clear blue skies and calm waters in the roads. That morning, the last of the workers were cleared from the vessel, many of whom were still making final adjustments, while Buchanan's flag officer's colors, a red pennant, was raised. Then she set off. Most of the crew were left in the dark about Buchanan's plans. They had been left under the presumption that this would be a 10-mile shakedown cruise. Lieutenant John R. Eggleston, recounting the events after the war, had been left with this presumption. In fact, out of all of the officers and men aboard the CSS Virginia, only Buchanan and Catesby Jones knew of the intended goal of the day. However, an engagement was anticipated. As the Virginia steamed down the Elizabeth River, she was accompanied by CSS Beaufort and CSS Raleigh. Along the way, the locals of Norfolk and Portsmouth assembled along the shore, watching the odd sight steam down the river to the roads. William Howard Parker, commander of CSS Beaufort, recalled the sight. Nearly every man, woman, and child in the 2 cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth were at the same time on their way to Sewell's Point, Cranny Island, and other points, where they could see the great naval combat which they knew was at last to take place. Some went by land, others by water. All the batteries were manned, all work was suspended in public and private yards, and those who were forced to remain behind were offering up prayers for our success. A great stillness came over the land. A flag officer Forrest, who commanded the station, accompanied by all the officers of the Navy Yard, went down with us in the Harmony as far as Cranny Island, 4.5 miles below Norfolk. Everything that would float, from the Army tugboat to the oysterman skiff, was on its way down to the same point loaded to the water's edge with spectators. As we steamed down the harbor, we were saluted by the waving of caps and handkerchiefs. But no voice broke the silence of the scene. All hearts were too full of utterance. An attempt at cheering would have ended in tears, for all realized the fact that here was to be tried the great experiment of the ram and ironclad in naval warfare. The ram aspect was one that Buchanan was keen to test above all else. Prior to setting off, Buchanan met with Chief Engineer Ashton Ramsey. He asked the officer, "What would happen to your engines and boilers if there should be a collision?" Ramsey replied that the machinery was secured in place and the 10-mile trip should be sufficient to test the engine's reliability. Buchanan was satisfied with the response, proclaiming, "I am going to ram the Cumberland. I am told she has the new rifled guns, the only ones in their whole fleet we have cause to fear. The moment we are out in the roads, I'm going to make right for her and ram her." The engines had performed well enough during the trip down the river, far above the expectations of Ramsey. By this point, the crew was well aware of Buchanan's intentions, even if he had not expressed them yet. Men were already at their stations. Assistant Surgeon Algernon S. Garnett was preparing his surgical equipment for the upcoming engagement. Tensions were running high. Buchanan stepped from his station in the pilot house down onto the gun deck to address the crew. "Sailors, in a few minutes you will have the long-awaited opportunity to show your devotion to your country and our cause. Remember that you are about to strike for your country and your homes, your wives, and your children. The Confederacy expects every man to do his duty. Beat to quarters." Hardin Beverly Littlepage also stated that Buchanan also told us that the Confederates had complained that they were not taken near enough to the enemy, and assured us that there should be no such complaint this time, for he intended to head directly for the Cumberland. Meanwhile, the Federal flotilla seemed unaware of what was about to happen. The frigates USS Roanoke, USS Minnesota, and USS St. Lawrence were stationed nearby Fort Monroe. The former two were sister ships of the Merrimac. Anchored nearby Newport News Point was the 50-gun frigate USS Congress and the 30-gun sloop of war USS Cumberland. According to Lieutenant Wood, boats were hanging on the lower booms, washed clothes, and the rigging. Nothing indicated that we were expected. Lieutenant William Parker would also express the same, stating, "The Congress and Cumberland were lying off Newport News and were riding to the last of the flood tide. They had their washed clothes up at the time we saw them, I remember, which shows how entirely unexpected our appearance was. In fact, the captain of the Cumberland, Commander William C. Radford, was at this time on board the frigate Roanoke below Old Point, attending a court-martial." The Federal flotilla, in spite of a number of warning signs, had been taken by surprise. The flotilla was soon rushed into action at the peculiar yet threatening sight steaming from out the mouth of the Elizabeth River. Acting Master Henry Reaney, commanding the gunboat USS Zouave, recalled first seeing the vessel. "A little after dinner, about 12:30, the quartermaster on watch called my attention to black smoke in the Elizabeth River, close to Cranny Island. We let go from the wharf and ran alongside the Cumberland. The officer of the deck ordered us to run down toward Pig Point and find out what was coming down from Norfolk. It did not take us long to find out, for we had not gone over 2 miles when we saw what, to all appearances, looked like the roof of a very big barn, belching forth smoke as from a chimney on fire. We were all divided in opinion as to what was coming. The boatswain's mate was the first to make out the Confederate flag, and then we all guessed it was the Merrimac come at last." The Zouave would fire several rounds from her 30-pounder parent gun before being ordered to withdraw. Meanwhile, USS Minnesota and Roanoke began firing up their boilers, though the Roanoke's engines were disabled, requiring for her to be towed, while the crews of the Cumberland and Congress rapidly prepared for the engagement. Along the shoreline, the batteries nearby Newport News began firing their guns as the Virginia slowly steamed into range. The shot and shell from the shore batteries and the guns of the USS Cumberland and Congress had little effect, bouncing harmlessly off the ironclad's armored hull. At 2:20 p.m., the Confederate flotilla opened fire. The CSS Beaufort, with her 32-pounder gun, fired the first shot. However, Buchanan opted to wait until within 1,500 yards range before opening fire with a 7-inch Brooke rifle mounted in the bow of the vessel. The first shot hit the Cumberland's starboard railing, sending splinters across the deck. The second round hit just below the Cumberland's forward pivot gun. The Virginia steamed abreast of the Congress and slipped by her. However, the Congress would not let the ironclad slip by without a reply. As Lieutenant John Eccleston recalled, "The view from my station was restricted to the gun port, some 3 by 4 feet. For a time, only the wide waters of the bay and the distant shores were visible, till suddenly the port became the frame of the picture of a great ship. It was the Congress, only about 100 yards distant. But for an instant was she visible. For suddenly there leapt from her sides the flash of 35 guns, and as many shot and shell were hurled against her armor, only to be thrown from it high into the air. As by a miracle, no projectile entered into the wide open ports." The Virginia replied with her 4 guns, yielding far more devastating results for the Congress. One shot went through a gun port, dismounting one of her guns and the crew commanding it. Another shot, this one a hot shot round, ignited 2 fires in the vessel, one erupting dangerously close to the powder magazine. All the while, the Virginia continued to steam towards the Cumberland, shells harmlessly bouncing off her armored sides, and either exploding in the air or rolling down her sloped sides and hissing as they contacted the water. Buchanan, undeterred by the fire, stood in the hatchway, aft of the pilot house. Allegedly, he called out for the Cumberland to surrender, to which Lieutenant George Upham Morris, acting executive officer, replied, "Never!" The Virginia continued to steam closer to the vessel until the 1,500-pound cast-iron ram slammed into her hull. Assistant Engineer E.A. Jack stated, "Soon, however, I heard the report of our own guns, and then there came a tremor throughout the whole ship, and I was nearly thrown from the coal bucket upon which I was sitting. This is when we drove into the Cumberland with our ram. Then the crack and breaking of her timbers told full well how fatal to her that collision was. Then there was a sudden motion of our vessel that aroused suspicion that our ship had been injured too, and was sinking. The ram was lodged firmly into the Cumberland's side, threatening to bring the Virginia to the bottom with her. However, as fortune would have it, the ram itself had been an afterthought and was poorly mounted to the bow of the vessel. As a consequence, the ram broke off, dislodging the Virginia from the mortally wounded Cumberland. The Virginia drifted broadside to the Cumberland, and the two warships exchanged fire for half an hour. It was during this firefight that the Virginia would sustain the most damage and losses. Charles Dunbar, a crew member in the bow gun, was killed when he was shot by a man on the USS Cumberland. A shell blew up in front of the sill of the bow port, killing 2 and wounding a number of others. Virtually everything on the upper part of the vessel was swept away from the intense firefight, and the smokestack was riddled with holes, which caused issues with ventilation for the engines below and filled the gun deck with smoke. 2 of the Dahlgrens were also damaged. Their muzzles were shot off, yet the crew continued to operate the damaged pieces. With the Virginia freed from her near-death experience and having sufficiently dueled the sloop of war, she began to steam up once more, driving hard to starboard. Lieutenant John Taylor Wood, manning the aft Brooke rifle, was now able to bring the gun to bear against the Congress. He was able to get 3 raking shots off against the Congress, while the Virginia continued her hard starboard turn, allowing for Lieutenant Wood to get a good look at the sinking Cumberland. In the meantime, the Cumberland continued the fight, though our ram had opened her side wide enough to drive in a horse and cart. Soon she listed the port and filled rapidly. The crew were driven by the advancing water to the spar deck, and there worked her pivot guns until she went down with a roar, the colors still flying. No ship was ever fought more gallantly. Aboard the Cumberland, the order to abandon ship had been given at 3:35 p.m. The crew of the vessel had put up a gallant fight, having lost 121 men in her fight against the Virginia. The smoke from the ensuing battle and fires burning all around had obscured the battle for many watching on the southern shore of Hampton Roads, placing doubt in the minds of many of the success of Virginia's actions. Brigadier General Raleigh E. Colston, observing the battle from his post at the mouth of the Nansemond River, noted years later, "The entire horizon was lighted up by the continual flashes of the artillery of these combatants. The broadsides of the Roanoke and St. Lawrence and the Sewell's Point batteries, clouds of white smoke rose in spiral columns to the skies, illuminated by the evening sunlight, while land and water seemed to tremble under the thunders of the cannonade." During the Virginia's wide arcing turn, she sailed upriver a short distance away from the Cumberland. Along the northern bank, a number of transports, shore batteries, and vessels were stationed. The shore batteries opened fire upon the Virginia, but, as with every other vessel that day, they did little to the ironclad. All the while, an opportunity presented itself. Buchanan later wrote, "We silenced several of the batteries and did much injury on the shore. A large transport steamer alongside the wharf was blown up, 1 schooner sunk, and another captured and sent to Norfolk. The loss of life on shore we have no way of ascertaining." It was at this point that Commander Tucker's 3 gunboat squadron joined alongside the Virginia and sailed down the river. However, the CSS Patrick Henry would be hit in her boiler room, meaning only the CSS Teaser and Jamestown would be able to join the Virginia. All the while, the USS Minnesota, Roanoke, and St. Lawrence ran aground. The Roanoke would be freed and sail towards the safety of Fort Monroe, while the St. Lawrence would be freed only to run aground once more. The flotilla steamed towards the Congress, relentlessly shelling the vessel as the Zouave attempted to save her. Henry Rainey recalled his efforts to save the Congress from the Virginia's wrath. When we had her headed toward the shore, the Merrimac got right astern of us and opened fire, pouring broadside after broadside that raked her far and aft, overthrowing several of the guns and killing a number of the crew. About this time, we were in rather a bad plight. The blood was running from the Congress scuppers onto our deck, like water on a wash-deck morning. The tallow cup on top of our cylinder, and the pilot house and billet head of the stem were shattered by shot. The pilot, Mr. Phillips, was stunned. Our Zouave figurehead, which was a fixture on top of the pilot house, carried away by a shot on its way over the bows, disabled 2 of the crew of the Rifle. It was about this time that the Congress grounded, and the white flag was hoisted. Firing ceased, and a rebel steamer was making for us. I told Lieutenant Pendergrast that if he did not want me any more, I'd leave and try to escape. He told me to take care of myself, as they had surrendered. During the ensuing shelling, Lieutenant Joseph Smith, acting commander of the Congress, was killed when a shell fragment tore off his head and a part of his shoulder. Lieutenant Austin Pendergrast would take command, and, after consulting Commander William Smith, former captain of the Congress, Pendergrast surrendered the Congress. Immediately upon receiving this surrender, Buchanan ceased all fire from his flotilla and ordered the Beaufort and Raleigh to sail up alongside the Congress to begin receiving the wounded and officers before burning her. Commander William Parker accepted the surrender of the vessel, though he was struck with grief over the death of Joseph Smith, his former Annapolis classmate. The Jamestown was brought alongside to assist in this operation, but this was interrupted when a sudden eruption of rifle fire came from the northern shore. Several men were killed, and Commander Parker had several holes cut through his coat, his cap was knocked off from his head, and 1 round lightly injured his knee. The rifle fire was coming from the men of Brigadier General Joseph K. F. Mansfield. Mansfield had witnessed the fighting in the roads, which saw 1 artillery shell from the Virginia crash into his headquarters in Camp Butler and sent splinters flying his direction. Upon seeing the Congress surrender and the Confederates offloading the wounded men, Mansfield began to take action. The enemy then sent 2 steamers with Confederate flags flying and made fast on either side of her, with a view to haul her off or burn her. As soon as I saw this, I ordered Colonel Brown of the 20th Indiana Regiment, then close at hand, to send 2 rifle companies, A and K, to the beach. The 2 rifled guns, under Captain Howard, and a rifled Dahlgren howitzer, manned by Master Stuyvesant and 14 sailors of the Cumberland, went into action from a raking position on the beach, covered by sandbanks and trees, against these steamers. Parker was forced to withdraw the Beaufort away from the Congress as the fire from the shoreline raged on. Buchanan, who was unaware of the events transpiring, presumed this was due to Parker's timidness, an opinion he'd developed since Parker's student days at the Naval Academy. In response, Lieutenant Miner volunteered to take the only surviving cutter on the Virginia and continue to collect the wounded. He, along with the CSS Teaser, sailed up to the Congress to continue the operation. However, Mansfield was watching from the shoreline and acted against this force. We here had them at about 800 yards to an advantage, and immediately they let go of their hold on the Congress and moved out of range with much loss. They endeavored to approach her again with a steamer and a rowboat, but were beaten off with loss, till finally the Merrimac, finding her prize retaken, approached and fired 3 shots into her and set her on fire. Lieutenant Miner was shot in the chest and knocked back in the cutter. However, he managed to survive this wounding and was taken aboard the Teaser. Meanwhile, Buchanan became enraged. "Destroy that damned ship! She's firing on our white flag!" The Virginia began to fire upon the Congress, while Buchanan climbed up top of the Virginia's casemate and, being given a rifle, began to take pot shots at the opposite shore. Mansfield's men took notice of this person on the top deck and began to concentrate their fire on him. A bullet lodged itself into Buchanan's thigh, grazing his femoral artery. Wounded, Buchanan was taken below as the Virginia poured several rounds of hot shot into the Congress. The ship was soon set ablaze. The Virginia, now under the command of Quarstein Jones, began to set sail towards the stranded Minnesota. She would fire a number of rounds at the Minnesota, some of which found their mark, killing a number of men aboard. However, it was 5 p.m. and the tide was going out. This forced the Virginia to remain within the deeper sections of the channel. Thus, with a few more long-range shots, the Virginia would retire to Sewell's Point, waiting until tomorrow to finish off the trapped vessel. The day's events had already produced a sizable impact on McClellan's plans. Major General John E. Wool, commander of Fort Monroe, became increasingly concerned that the Virginia, which had so far resisted virtually every gun in Hampton Roads, would be the vanguard of a much larger assault to seize Fort Monroe. On March 9th, McClellan responded with the following dispatch. If the rebels obtain full command of the water, it would seem impossible for you to hold Newport News. You are therefore authorized to evacuate that place, drawing the garrison in upon Fort Monroe, which, I need not say to so brave an officer, is to be held at all hazards, as I will risk everything to sustain you should you be attacked by superior forces. From indications here, I suspect an intention of the enemy to fall back nearer to Richmond, that they may better concentrate their forces. An attack on you is not improbable. If the 15-inch gun is still at the Newport News, I would suggest its immediate removal to either Fort Monroe or Fort Calhoun, unless it will enable you to retain possession of Newport News. By authorizing you to withdraw from Newport News, I do not mean to give you the order to do so, but to relieve you from grave sense of responsibility, which every good officer feels in such a case. I would only evacuate Newport News when it became clear that the rebels would certainly obtain complete control of the water and render it untenable. Do not run the risk of placing its garrison under the necessity for surrendering. You will also please inform me fully of your views and wishes, the practicability and necessity of reinforcing you. The performances of the Merrimack place a new aspect upon everything. I may very probably change my whole plan of campaign just on the eve of execution. While McClellan remained level-headed throughout the affair, trusting his commanding officer at Fort Monroe, the mood among Lincoln's cabinet was different. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, recalled Stanton's reaction to the news of the destruction wrought by the Virginia in his post-war accounts. But the most frightened man on that gloomy day, the most so I think of any during the rebellion, was the Secretary of War. He was at times almost frantic, and as he walked the room with his eyes fixed on me, I saw well the estimation in which he held me with my unmoved and unexcited manner and conversation. "The Merrimack," he said, "would destroy every vessel in the service, could lay every city on the coast under contribution, could take Fortress Monroe. McClellan's mistaken purpose to advance by the peninsula must be abandoned, and Burnside would inevitably be captured. Likely the first movement of the Merrimack would be to come up the Potomac and disperse Congress, destroy the Capitol, erect public buildings. Or she might go to New York and Boston and destroy those cities, or levy from them contributions sufficient to carry on the war." Wells alleviated his fears as best as he could, which ultimately worked. I stated our vessels were not as powerful or in numbers as extensive as I wished. It was certain, however, the Merrimack could not come to Washington and go to New York at the same time. I had no apprehension of her visiting either, and wished she were then in the Potomac, for if so, we could take efficient measures to dispose of her. That Burnside and the force in the Sounds were safe from her, because her draft of water was such she could not approach them. That the Monitor was in Hampton Roads, and I had confidence in her power to resist, and, I hoped, to overcome the Merrimack. She should have been there sooner to have destroyed the Merrimack, but the contractors had disappointed us. Indeed, the USS Monitor had arrived in the Roads that evening, and witnessed for herself the destruction wrought by the Virginia, as the Congress, still burning, violently tore itself asunder in a large explosion. Meanwhile, the Virginia, anchored at Sewell's Point, was inspected by Quarstein Jones. Outside of the loss of most everything mounted on the outer part of the superstructure and a small lake near the bow, the vessel was relatively unharmed. He had not realized, however, that the ram had been torn off. He presumed it had been bent or warped. Lieutenant James Wood would later write, All losses in killed and wounded was 21. The armor was hardly damaged, though at one time our ship was the focus on which were directed at least 100 heavy guns, afloat and ashore. But nothing outside escaped. 2 guns were disabled by having their muzzles shot off. The ram was left in the side of the Cumberland. 1 anchor, the smokestack, and the steam pipes were shot away. Railings, stanchions, boat davits, everything was swept clean. The flagstaff was repeatedly knocked over, and finally a boarding pike was used. Commodore Buchanan and the other wounded were sent to the Naval Hospital, and after making preparations for the next day's fight, we slept at our guns, dreaming of other victories in the morning. Contrary to Kingston General's claim, the Virginia had come out of the fight relatively unscathed. Outside of the outer mountings, the ship had managed to survive the onslaught of the entirety of the Federal Navy, throwing shot and shell at her from every available gun. Several hundred artillery pieces of various size and caliber were trained against the Virginia. Yet the ship managed not only to survive, but to do far more grievous damage upon the enemy. In an instant, the wooden frigate was consigned to the grave, while the Virginia stood victorious. It was fully the intention of Catesby Jones, now acting officer of the Virginia, to sally forth once more and deal the final blow to the Minnesota, ran aground in the roads. However, at around 11 p.m., one of the pilots of the Virginia had noticed something in the horizon, which the pilot proclaimed to be the Erickson. It was indeed the arrival of John Erickson's invention, the USS Monitor. The USS Monitor was a truly unique design for a warship, a peculiar vessel that was as much a reflection of the inventive nature of her creator as much as it was an embodiment of the desperation of the Union to press forth an armored warship to counter the threat of a Confederate counterpart. Before we can understand the Monitor, we must first understand her creator, John Erickson. John Erickson was born in Långbundshyttan, Värmland, Sweden on July 31, 1803. From a young age, Erickson was known for his inventive skill and, at the age of 13, joined the Swedish Navy. In 1829, he would immigrate to England and, in collaboration with John Braithwaite, designed and built the locomotive Novelty, which participated in the Rainhill trials, although their design was beaten by Stephens's rocket. During his time in England, he would work in close collaboration with the Royal Navy, developing a wide range of nautical inventions, from screw propellers to fathommeters, that would be trialed on British warships. He would be noticed by Robert F. Stockton, a naval officer in the United States Navy, who would convince Erickson to immigrate to the United States in 1839. He would work in collaboration with Stockton on the construction of the USS Princeton, furnishing for her the 12-inch shell gun, the Oregon. However, animosity had stirred between the two men, with Stockton developing his own 12-inch shell gun, the Peacemaker, though this shell gun would prove to be fatally flawed as it used a faulty construction method. Stockton took credit for most of the work on the Princeton and conveniently neglected to address Erickson of the departure of the vessel for Washington, D.C. from New York. On February 29, 1844, Stockton's Peacemaker would be tested for the amusement of President John Tyler and his cabinet, only for it to fail catastrophically, resulting in the deaths of Tyler's Secretary of State, Secretary of the Navy, and the Chief of the Bureau of Construction. In an odd set of circumstances, Stockton was exonerated of any wrongdoing, yet Erickson was found at fault for the incident. This led to John Erickson's general mistrust of the U.S. Navy. With the outbreak of the American Civil War and the rumors of the Confederacy building their own ironclads, Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, realized the urgent need to produce ironclads for the naval squadrons operating along the coast. On July 4, 1861, Welles approached Congress and asked for an appropriation of $1.5 million for the construction of 3 experimental ironclads. This was authorized by Congress on August 3, 1861, and signed by President Abraham Lincoln the following day. Welles began soliciting bids for potential ironclad designs. The first accepted was of a traditional European ironclad design proposed by American Sons of Philadelphia that would be known as New Ironsides. The second bid accepted would come from Cornelius Bushnell, who provided the design for an ironclad developed by Samuel Pooke, a 950-ton warship that would be known as Galena. Right now, many a naval fan may be recoiling in pain from hearing the utterance of her name. For those naval aficionados, the criticisms of this vessel had come as early as the conceptualization stage, though not for what would be presumed. Questions arose over her seaworthiness, which prompted Bushnell to ask one of his close partners, Cornelius Delameter, who directed Bushnell to address one of his close clients, John Ericsson. Ericsson deemed the design to be seaworthy as she was, but also caught the ear of Bushnell when he brought up a design for a floating battery he had conceptualized and proposed to the French during the Crimean War. Bushnell would then inform Wells of Ericsson's design. Bushnell would first bring this proposal before the Ironclad Board on September 13, 1861. This meeting, which had Lincoln in attendance, saw the board heavily criticize Ericsson's design. This prompted for Bushnell to ask for Ericsson to come to Washington and personally address the board. Ericsson would attend a meeting of the Ironclad Board on September 15, 1861. However, the Ironclad Board was not gracious when it came to hospitality towards Ericsson. In fact, according to Ericsson, he was seen as an unwelcome guest and that his design had already been rejected. Ericsson, who was heated over this, did the best he could to explain his design to the board. At the end, he declared, "Gentlemen, after what I have said, I consider it to be your duty to the country to give me an order to build the vessel before I leave this room." He was asked to return to the board later that day, only this time he was confronted solely by Commodore Paulding, who approved of his idea, with Wells approving of the design and addressing Ericsson to begin construction at once. The prototype design was fleshed out further by Ericsson. The ship, or as Ericsson would refer to it, the floating battery, would have two hull sections to note. The upper section of the hull had a length of 172 feet and a beam of 41 feet, while the lower section was smaller, having a length of 122 feet and a beam of 34 feet. The total height from the underside of the deck to the keel plate was 11 feet 2 inches, while the vessel would have a draught of 10 feet. This ship design, though small, was necessary. Ericsson noted that the limited time constraints for designing, constructing, and launching this vessel, in addition to the shallow waterways the vessel would be operating in, meant a smaller design was necessary. Going from fore to aft, the vessel's anchor was designed to slot within an anchor well, which was protected by the iron-plated, wood-backed upper hull structure. This was a deliberate design choice by Ericsson as a means of protecting the anchor from enemy fire, thus preventing it from being shot off. Situated 10 feet behind the anchor well was the pilot house. Its internal dimensions were 3 feet 6 inches long, 2 feet 8 inches wide, and 3 feet 10 inches high above the deck plating. It was built using 12-inch deep, 9-inch thick iron blocks fastened to the deck by 3-inch bolts. Small slits, approximately 3/8 of an inch wide, were accounted for in the construction of the iron casemate, which offered a wide field of view for the helmsman and captain. However, against Ericsson's judgment, these slits were widened, which will become important later in this analysis. Inside was housed the steering wheel for navigating the vessel, and it could be accessed by a ladder from the lower deck. Behind the pilot house were the crew's quarters. According to Ericsson, the design for the quarters was done with the presumption that half of the crew would be at post, meaning it was designed to accommodate half of the total crew number. The space was 50 feet long, starting 5 feet from the pilot house towards the transverse bulkhead for the turret, of which 24 feet were dedicated to officers' quarters. The space was ventilated with 2 centrifugal blowers, which were steam-operated and fed air from outside the vessel below deck. However, these quarters, though designed as best as possible, were not satisfactory to the crew aboard the Monitor. Lieutenant Green recalled the conditions within the vessel. "Probably no ship was ever devised which was so uncomfortable for her crew, and certainly no sailor ever led a more disagreeable life than we did on the James River, suffocating with heat and bad air if we remained below, and a target for sharpshooters if we came on deck." Just after the crew quarters was the turret housing in the turret itself. The turret was a cylindrical-shaped object made by bolting 8 layers of 1-inch thick iron plating together. The roof of the structure was a grated iron fixture with hatchways to allow for men to climb on top. The turret structure rested upon a bronze ring set into the deck, which would form a watertight seal. Within the turret were to be fitted 2 naval cannons mounted upon a set of rails. The gun ports were protected by 2 port stoppers suspended on a pendulum above the gun ports. The turret's rotation mechanism was powered by a small steam engine. This would drive a double train of cog wheels that were connected to the vertical axle of the turret, which was stepped and a bronze bearing affixed to the vessel. This system could be operated by 1 man working below. Beyond the turret housing was the engine room. A pair of boilers powered a 1-cylinder engine which turned a crankshaft attached to a 4-bladed propeller. The propeller had a diameter of 9 feet and was protected by the hull from enemy fire. A number of changes were made during the process of building the vessel, much of which were the inclusion of a number of Ericsson's other inventions. Originally, the armament of the vessel was to be Ericsson's steam gun and hydrostatic javelins, which were an early version of what we know today as self-propelled torpedoes. However, these were rejected as building these armaments would have taken too much time. Instead, more readily available Dahlgrens would have to be utilized. In addition, the sloped deck, as originally shown in his proposal to Napoleon III and originally carried over in early designs, was altered into a flat deck for the vessel. In addition, the turret would gain an additional layer of armor to help protect the crew inside from flying bolts when a round impacted the turret. The construction of the vessel would be parceled out between various iron manufactories throughout the north. The Continental Iron Works, located at Greenport Shipyard in Brooklyn, would handle the construction of the ironclad. The turret would be assembled at Novelty Iron Works across the river from Greenport. The single-stroke engines and boilers would be constructed at the Delameter Iron Works, a short distance from the others. The Abbott firm, located near Baltimore, Maryland, was tasked with constructing the curved 1-inch iron plates, which were to be transported to the Novelty Iron Works for assembly. The Niagara Steam Forge, located in Buffalo, New York, would be responsible for constructing the port stoppers. The turret was first assembled at Novelty Iron Works. However, due to its 120-ton weight, it could not be shipped whole across the river. This required disassembling and coating each part. From there, it would be shipped in pieces and reassembled on the deck of the vessel. The vessel was to be built within a period of 100 days, though, as the January 12th deadline came and went, she was still under construction, though completion was only a few weeks away. In the meantime, the crew for Ericsson's battery was being selected. Her commanding officer would be Lieutenant John Lomer Worden. Born on March 12, 1818 in Mount Pleasant Township, Westchester County, New York, he had 27 years of naval experience under his belt. He had attended the Philadelphia Naval School, worked at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., and fought in the Mexican-American War prior to the Secession Crisis and the outbreak of war. On April 13, 1861, he would become the first Union prisoner of war when detained by Confederate authorities. He was held in Montgomery, Alabama, until exchanged on November 22, 1861. On January 11, 1862, Commodore Joseph Smith sent the following letter to Worden. My dear sir, I have only time to say I have named you for the command of the battery under contract with Captain Ericsson, now nearly ready at New York. This vessel is an experiment. I believe you are the right sort of officer to put in command of her. Worden was enthusiastic about taking up the position. In a response written on January 13, 1862, he addressed the former. Dear Sir, I received your letter on the 11th instant yesterday, and thank you for the feeling which prompted you to name me for the command of the Ericsson battery. I went immediately to see her, and, after a hasty examination of her, am induced to believe that she may prove a success. At all events, I am quite willing to be an agent in testing her capabilities, and will readily devote whatever of capacity and energy I have to that object. If the department decides that I am to have the command, I would like to be ordered to her as soon as possible, so that I may acquaint myself with all her points and peculiarities. The commission would oblige, making his appointment official the same day. Besides Worden, another unofficial member of her crew would be Albin Crocker Steimers. He acted as an official observer who, on October 4, 1861, was assigned to observe the construction of Ericsson's battery. He'd remain with the vessel after completion, as his knowledge in engineering was superb. Another officer assigned early on was Paymaster William Frederick Keeler. He was a civilian prior to the war, and though he had been out to sea during the gold rush, he was not experienced pertaining to military affairs. However, his job did not require military skills. He was to act as a clerk aboard the vessel, which required accounting for the supplies, equipment, and handling the pay for the sailors. Worden's first task was to find the crew for the vessel. For executive officer, Worden would select Lieutenant Samuel Donna Green. Louis Napoleon Straughter and John Joshua Nathaniel Weber, both volunteers with prior sea service, were to act as the acting masters. The petty officers included a wide range of different nationalities. Petty Officer George Fredrickson was born in Denmark before immigrating to the United States, while Quartermaster Peter Williams was Norwegian-born. A number of the crew went by various aliases, one example being Quartermaster Peter Truscott, whose real name was Samuel Lewis. Worden would assess the vessel's size and crew need, eventually relaying the following information to Gideon Wells. In estimating the number of her crew, I allowed 15 men and a quarter gunner for the 2 guns, 11 men for the powder division, and 1 for the wheel, which I deem ample for the efficient working of her guns in action. That would leave 12 men, including those available in the engineers department, to supply deficiencies at the guns, caused by sickness or casualties. I proposed to use a portion of the petty officers at the guns, and in naming the number of that class I thought I would be enabled to obtain a better class of men for that purpose. It is believed that 17 men and 2 officers in the turret would be as many as could work there with advantage. A greater number would be in each other's way and cause embarrassment. The limited accommodations of the battery and the insufficiency of ventilation renders it important that as few as is consistent with her efficiency in action should be put in her. Beyond this, Worden was tasked with procuring the armament for the vessel. Ideally, Erickson wished for 2 12-inch Dahlgrens to be furnished for the vessel. However, due to a lack of shells for the 12-inch Dahlgrens, 2 11-inch Dahlgrens were acquired from the USS Dakota and would be mounted in the turret on January 30th, 1862. At 10 a.m. on January 30th, 1862, the vessel, named USS Monitor at the suggestion of Erickson, was launched into the East River. Many skeptics of the vessel's capabilities to float were dismissed upon seeing Erickson, who was standing atop the deck of the vessel during her launch, not getting plunged into the East River. Worden, however, was still sorting out the crew situation. He would go to the North Carolina and Sabine and ask for volunteers, to which he received an overwhelming response. Worden vetted the volunteers and sifted from them the most capable men. On February 19, 1862, the ironclad would be turned over to the U.S. Navy for testing. It is here that numerous flaws in the design would be found. These flaws were: 1. The speaking tube linking the turret to the pilot house only worked as intended when the turret faced towards the pilot house. 2. The pilot house, which had been intended to be mounted atop the turret but was moved towards the bow, was isolated and exposed in the event of an errant broadside. This had been, in part, compensated for by plating the section in thick iron blocks. 3. As stated previously, the pilot house's viewing ports were widened, placing the crewmen inside the pilot house at greater risk of injury from explosive shells. 4. The space within the pilot house, as outlined in prior sections, was small, making the space cramped. 5. During her first sea trials, it was found that there were steering problems, which required additional repairs. 6. The planned top speed of 9 knots was not achieved. In fact, during her first sea trial, she managed a paltry 3.5 knots, which was improved to 6 knots. 7. When the port stoppers were installed, Erickson had discovered he'd made a critical error. The mechanism that allowed for them to open prevented the other from opening, meaning only one stopper could be opened at any given time. Beyond this, the USS Monitor featured over 40 of Erickson's patented inventions. She was a peculiarity in naval warfare, which brought with it a number of problems. During the testing trials, Steimers was testing the guns aboard the carriages designed by Erickson. Each carriage had a screw affixed towards the outer sides. These screws were designed by Erickson as left-hand screws that both turned counterclockwise, which would tighten the brakes on the guns. During test firing, Steimers presumed gun number 1 screw was a right-hand turned screw and made the appropriate adjustment. When the gun was discharged, it flew off the carriage and slammed against the rear of the turret. Luckily, no one was hurt. Steimers then went to gun number 2 and presumed the wheel would be turned in the opposite direction, and discharging this gun yielded the same results. Luckily, no one was hurt. The Monitor, it can be said, suffered from the flaws of a revolutionary design. No vessel of its type had been built before, meaning it was bound to have a number of critical flaws with the design. More so than this, the inclusion of many of Ericsson's personal inventions further complicated matters. Thus, she was far from an ideal warship. However, if one were to go by the testimony of kings and generals, you would presume otherwise. In addition, her construction renders the notion of the Monitor having any strong side to her armor to present as nonsensical in of itself. It further demonstrates the lackluster quality of research from the channel in question. Regardless, after another sea trial was conducted on February 27, 1862, during poor weather, the steering problems were corrected over the course of 3 days by Ericsson, allowing for her to steer much better than previously. On March 4, 1862, Flag Officer Hiram Paulding, Commandant of the New York Naval Yard, issued the following orders to Captain Worden. Sir, when the weather admits, you will proceed with the Monitor under your command to Hampton Roads, and on your arrival report to the senior naval officer there. I have hired the steamer James Freeborn to tow the Monitor, and have also directed the propellers Sachem and Currituck to attend on you to the mouth of the Chesapeake. If it should be necessary to retain them longer, you are authorized to do so. When you shall have no further occasion for the Freeborn, be pleased to give the captain a certificate with directions to return to New York, and immediately on his arrival report to me. Wishing you a safe and successful passage, I am, respectfully, your obedient servant, H. Paulding, Commandant. On the afternoon of March 6, 1862, the USS Monitor would set sail from the Brooklyn Navy Yard for Hampton Roads. As the James Freeborn could not be furnished, the Sethla was used as the Monitor's tow. They would be accompanied by the gunboats Currituck and Sachem during this voyage. Initially, the sailing was good. However, on March 7th, the Monitor would encounter rough weather. Water washed over the decks as waves as high as 10 feet slammed into every portion of the upper structure of the vessel. Lieutenant Green recalled the rough journey. The berth hatch leaked in spite of all we could do, and the water came down under the turret like a waterfall. It would strike the pilot house and go over the turret in beautiful curves, and it came through the narrow eye holes in the pilot house with such force as to knock the helmsman completely round from the wheel. The waves were high enough that they overtopped the 6-foot-tall ventilation ducts, causing water to leak into the boilers and ruining the leather belts that operated them. With ventilation cut off, the engineers aboard the Monitor began suffocating in the engine room. A second assistant engineer, Albert Campbell, recalled the experience. The next afternoon, we broke both our boiler belts, which spoiled the draft of our fires and drove all the gas into the engine room. This, of course, was rather inconvenient, for carbonic acid gas and hydrogen is not calculated to support animal life. I found myself getting weak and lost all consciousness, and did not know any more until I found myself on top of the turret with a couple of engineers lying alongside of me, looking more dead than anything else. Without enough fresh air feeding into the engine room, the fires in the boilers went out, which shut off the main pumps. With Worden unable to command due to seasickness, Lieutenant Green organized the men to help save the vessel. They first used the hand pumps, but they couldn't pump water up through the turret. In the end, Green was forced to use buckets to bail out water from the ship. The Monitor's flag was raised upside down to indicate their situation of distress. The Sethlo towed the Monitor out of the rough waters near the safe, shallow waters of Fenwick Island, Delaware, to weather out the storm. The weather soon died down. They were able to relight the boilers, and they resumed their voyage down the coast. However, things would once more worsen, as Lieutenant Green recalled. But at midnight, in passing over a shoal, rough weather was again encountered, and our troubles were renewed, complicated this time by the jamming of the wheel ropes, so that the safety of the ship depended entirely on the strength of the hawser which connected her with the tugboat. The hawser, being new, held fast, but during the greater part of the night we were constantly engaged in fighting the leaks, until we reached smooth water again, just before daylight. By the time they had made it out of the second squall, it was the morning of March 8, 1862. By 4 p.m. the same day, they rounded Cape Henry and could hear the distant sounds of artillery fire coming from the west. This was the sounds of battle coming from the roads, where every federal gun in Hampton Roads was trained against the Virginia during her rampage. The Monitor would finally arrive in Hampton Roads at 9 p.m., with the Congress burning in the distance, and the naval squadron in complete disarray. Worden announced his arrival to Captain Marston, who suggested that the Monitor anchor nearby the stranded Minnesota, still stuck on the shoals west of Fortress Monroe. Whatever was in store for the Monitor tomorrow, she would be ready for it. Early on the morning of March 9th, 1862, the crew of the CSS Virginia ate their breakfast with 2 jiggers of whiskey, and they were euphoric from the previous day's success. Catesby Jones, taking over command of the Virginia from Buchanan, wished to replicate those results that morning. At 6 a.m., the Virginia, along with the Patrick Henry, Jamestown, and Teaser, set off from Sewell's Point. Fog had delayed them for several hours, but by 8 a.m., they set out towards the stranded Minnesota. She was still stuck on the shoal, an easy first target for the Virginia to take out before moving on to the rest of the fleet. Her Bow-Brook rifle fired the first shot at the Minnesota, which tore through her rigging. A second round pierced the wooden hull of the vessel, detonating inside and inflicting serious casualties. However, the Union's latest asset made her entrance. As Henry Ashton Ramsay recalled, "We approached her slowly, feeling our way cautiously along the edge of the channel, when suddenly, to our astonishment, a black object that looked like the historic description, a barrel head afloat with a cheese box on top of it, moved slowly out from under the Minnesota and boldly confronted us." The prior evening, Captain Worden met with Captain Gershom Jacques Henry von Brunt, commanding officer of the USS Minnesota, about their situation. Von Brunt had told the other that he would attempt to free the Minnesota from the shoal around 2 a.m. on the morning of the 9th. However, this attempt failed. Von Brunt had little faith in the Monitor's capabilities and indicated that, if all else failed, he would destroy the Minnesota before surrendering the ship to the Virginia. The Monitor would do all she could to defend the stranded Minnesota. The crew made the necessary preparations and had their breakfast at 7 a.m. Worden gave the crew a speech, rousing the worn-out men for the day's coming battle. Henry F. Keeler recalled the moments before the battle would begin. "Everyone was fixed at their post, fixed like a statue. The most profound silence reigned. If there had been a coward heart there, its throb would have been audible, so intense was the stillness. I experienced a peculiar sensation. I do not think it was fear, but it was different from anything I ever knew before. We were enclosed in what we supposed to be an impenetrable armor. We knew that a powerful foe was about to meet us. Ours was an untried experiment, and our enemy's first fire might make it a coffin for all." With the first shots fired by the Virginia, the Monitor immediately steamed into action. Captain Worden had determined the best course of action to save the Minnesota was to engage the Virginia as far away from the Minnesota as possible. Samuel Donna Green recalled the experience from his position within the turret. "Worden lost no time in bringing it to test. Getting his ship under way, he steered directly for the enemy's vessels, in order to meet and engage them as far as possible from the Minnesota. As he approached, the wooden vessels quickly turned and left. Our captain, to the astonishment of Captain Van Brunt, as he states in his official report, made straight for the Merrimac, which had already commenced firing, and when he came within short range, he changed his course so as to come alongside of her, stopped the engine, and gave the order, 'Commence firing!' The Monitor fired her first shot at the Virginia, which fell short and splashed in the water. In response, the Virginia's Bow-Brook rifle opened fire. This shot hit the Monitor's turret and failed to penetrate its thick armor plating. The vessels continued to exchange shots and volleys between one another, yet they had caused little damage to either ironclad. Both vessels crept to close range, exchanging shots repeatedly. Lieutenant Green recalled, "The fight continued with the exchange of broadsides as fast as the guns could be served, and at very short range, the distance between the vessels frequently being no more than a few yards." In spite of both vessels engaging at point-blank range, the overwhelming majority of the rounds fired by either vessel bounced harmlessly off the iron-plated siding of the other. Neither vessel was able to fully penetrate the other, and this had one probable cause for either side. In the case of the Virginia, no armor-piercing ammunition was made available for her to utilize in this particular event. She had been loaded with shell, hot shot, and canister rounds as she was expected to deal with a wooden fleet. By contrast, the Monitor's 11-inch Dahlgrens could penetrate the armor of the Virginia. However, at this time of the battle, the true strength of the Dahlgren guns was not yet tested, and the Navy advised only a maximum of 15 pounds of powder be used for each shot. It would not be until after the battle that double-charged rounds would be tested and greenlit by the United States Navy. As the vessels closed in, the Virginia had attempted to continue her course towards the Minnesota. However, disaster struck. The Virginia ran aground on what was known as the Middle Ground of Hampton Roads. Ellsbury V. White, acting assistant engineer aboard the Virginia, recalled the intense fighting as they remained stuck on the shoal. Thus, she continued circling around us, and every now and then throwing the heavy missiles against our sides. We, in response, as she passed around, brought every gun aboard our ship to bear upon her. Chief Engineer Henry Ashton Ramsey noted another grave problem, a vulnerability in the armor scheme of the Virginia. The coal consumption of the 2 days' fighting had lightened our prow until our unprotected submerged deck was almost awash. The armor of our sides below the waterline had not been extended but about 3 feet, owing to our hasty departure before the work was finished. Lightened as we were, these exposed portions rendered us no longer an ironclad, and the Monitor might have pierced us between wind and water had she depressed her guns. Yet, in spite of this glaring weakness, the Monitor failed to exploit it. Lieutenant Wood later stated, "Not a single shot struck us at the waterline, where the ship was utterly unprotected, and where one would have been fatal." On the Monitor, the inability to discern the weaknesses of the Virginia would be apparent, as Lieutenant Green, from his position manning the guns, noted, "The conditions were very different from those of an ordinary broadside gun, under which we had been trained on wooden warships. My only view of the world outside of the tower was over the muzzles of the guns, which cleared the ports by only a few inches. When the guns were run in, the portholes were covered by heavy iron pendulums, pierced with small holes to allow the iron rammer and sponge handles to protrude while they were in use. To hoist these pendulums required the entire gun's crew, and vastly increased the work inside the turret." In addition to the lack of visibility, the flaw in the communications tube between the pilot house and the turret was made self-evident. During the battle, Henry Keeler, who was not engaged in combat during the time, was tasked with relaying orders from Captain Warden in the pilot house to Lieutenant Green in the turret. Keeler performed the task well and received a commendation from Gideon Wells for his actions that day. As the Virginia's guns fired off at the Monitor's turret, the shot and shell would impact with such force that it would reverberate throughout the turret. The force was strong enough that, if any man were to lean against the walls of the turret, it would knock them down and stun them. Albin Steimers had rested his hand against the turret wall when a shell impacted the turret, knocking him down. Lewis Stoddard and Peter Truscott would both be knocked unconscious when a shell slammed into the turret while they were leaning against the turret wall. Meanwhile, the Virginia continued to receive intense fire from the Monitor while she replied in kind. One shot from the Monitor hit the Virginia's plating hard enough that it cracked the thick oak planking behind the 4-inch iron plates. The Virginia needed to dislodge herself from the shoal and do something. Ellsbury White would later remark, "Soon, however, we were relieved by the movement of our ship from the position which, for such a trying period, we had occupied." With the Virginia freed from the shoal, the fighting continued on with neither side penetrating the other's armor. Lieutenant Wood recalled an interaction between Catesby Jones and Lieutenant Eggleston. Coming down from the spar deck and observing the division standing at ease, Lieutenant Jones inquired, "Why are you not firing, Mr. Eggleston?" "Why, our powder is very precious," replied the lieutenant, "and after 2 hours' incessant firing, I find I could do her about as much damage by snapping my thumb at her every 2 minutes and a half." As it proved self-evident that neither vessel could harm the other with a simple shot and shell, Catesby Jones determined to follow the course of the previous day. He would ram the Monitor with the Virginia. Under the presumption that the ram was still intact, he wished to sink the Monitor with a singular blow. As Henry Keeler noted in his diary, "If she could so easily pierce the heavy oak beams of the Cumberland, she surely could go through the half-inch iron plates of our hull." The unwieldy Virginia was maneuvered into a position in which she could ram the Monitor. Eventually, the opportunity arose itself, and Jones gave the order to put the Virginia at full speed towards the Monitor. Yet, according to Ramsey, Jones was unsure of the maneuver's success, and, as with the ramming of the Cumberland the prior day, the engines were put in full reverse before she would impact the Monitor. However, Captain Worden was well aware of what the Virginia was attempting. He ordered Quartermaster Peter Williams to veer the Monitor off to starboard. The Virginia hit the Monitor with a glancing blow, which nearly knocked Keeler off his feet and rattled the Monitor. Only a dent was left in the iron plating below the hull of the vessel. Ramsey, down below, barely felt the impact of the collision. Jones called down below to check if they were making any water. A small leak had formed, but Ramsey assured Jones 2 separate times that the Worthing pumps were able to handle any leaks. To his recollection, there was no water leaking in the boiler room nor the engine room. The Virginia and the Monitor had escaped the ramming attempt relatively unharmed. The Monitor would fire both of her guns at the Virginia as she steamed past the large vessel. Lieutenant Wood, who stood nearby where the shells impacted, recalled their effect. Again, she came up on our quarter, her bow against our side, and at this distance fired twice. Both shots struck about halfway up the shield, abreast of the after pivot, and the impact forced aside in bodily 2 or 3 inches. All the crews of the after guns were knocked over by the concussion, and bled from the nose or ears. Another shot at the same place would have penetrated. Yet, in spite of this close-quarters broadside, the Virginia's armor held up. Now, an opportunity arose. The Virginia had maneuvered herself to where her guns could fire again upon the Minnesota. She fired a few rounds. One started a fire aboard the frigate, while another round struck the tug Dragon, which was sent to assist the stranded Minnesota. The Dragon's boilers blew up, and she was sunk next to the Minnesota. Worden was able to maneuver the Monitor in between the Virginia and the Minnesota. An opportunity presented itself for Worden to now ram the Virginia. The Virginia's fantail, where her rudder and propeller were situated, was now riding high in the water, enough so that water was churning from the propeller's rotation. Worden had the Monitor barrel towards the Virginia's exposed fantail, but, at the last moment, missed. The steering mechanism aboard the Monitor had malfunctioned, which led her off course. All the while, Lieutenant Wood's aft-brook rifle was ready to fire. It fired off an explosive round directly at the pilot house, which exploded just as Captain Worden was peering through the pilot's slits.
Fire! Captain!
My eyes! I am blind! Captain Worden exclaimed. In spite of this serious wound, Worden ordered for his helmsman, Peter Williams, to divert the Monitor towards the shoals next to the Minnesota. Lieutenant Green, who was in the turret, was not aware of the situation going on in the pilot house. He would be recalled from the turret by Worden in order to take up the responsibility of command. As Green recalled, he was a ghastly sight, with his eyes closed and the blood apparently rushing from every pore in the upper part of his face. He told me that he was seriously wounded and directed me to take command. I assisted in leading him to a sofa in his cabin, where he was tenderly cared for by Dr. Loge, and then I assumed command. Blind and suffering as he was, Worden's fortitude never forsook me. He frequently asked from his bed of pain of the progress of affairs, and when told that the Minnesota was saved, he said, "Then I can die happy." As the Monitor turned away, Catesby Jones sought to renew their assault of the Minnesota, yet there were a few issues that prevented such an assault. The pilots were unable to approach any closer to the Minnesota, as the shoal she had ran aground upon would catch the Virginia as well. With the tide going out, time was running out. In addition, the crew were thoroughly exhausted after hours of continuous combat, and there was a need to repair the damage sustained to the vessel. Jones would meet with his lieutenants and confer with them for what to do next. The majority agreed, returned to Norfolk for repairs. Lieutenant Wood was one of the few who objected to this. He desired to assault the ships nearby Fort Monroe. Ultimately, caution was taken and the Virginia withdrew thus. Catesby Jones set a course for Sewell's Point. The Virginia fired her last shot at 12:10 p.m. from Lieutenant Wood's aft Brook rifle. It had taken 30 minutes for Lieutenant Green to assess the situation upon taking command of the Monitor. However, by that point, the Virginia had conducted its withdrawal on the presumption they had beaten the Monitor. Thus, Green presumed they had beaten the Virginia. Yet, Green did not pursue the Virginia. It was understood his goal was to protect the Minnesota, and, with the damage sustained to the pilot house, Green was concerned another hit would destroy it, rendering her unable to steer. In addition, the Virginia was making for Sewell's Point, where the Confederate batteries were stationed. Thus, he determined it best to remain by the Minnesota and ensure her safety. Thus ended the Battle of Hampton Roads, an engagement that was the first of its kind on the planet. The battle had demonstrated the effectiveness of ironclads for both sides of the war, yet, as we've seen already, the battle's immediate effects would become self-evident in McClellan's upcoming campaign. This concludes Part 2. Stay tuned in for Part 3.